Episode 36, Bertha Benz's Journey, the final story. Benz, after receiving the telegram, rushed angrily to Pforzheim, convinced that the automobile must have been destroyed. As soon as he arrived at his in-laws' house, he shouted, calling out for Bertha. Hearing his voice from inside, his mother-in-law came out of her room and greeted Benz. She welcomed him as if she had been expecting him and suggested that he wait while she changed clothes so they could go together to where Bertha was. Benz was confused by this unexpected situation. He had assumed that the motor wagon was completely wrecked and that Bertha would be waiting anxiously at the house, but she was not there, and his mother-in-law appeared completely calm. Soon after his mother-in-law finished changing, they left the house together. As they walked, a large open field came into view, and many people were gathered there. Benz instinctively felt that Bertha and the motor wagon would be there, and he hurried forward. As he expected, the motor wagon, Bertha, and their two sons were there. Bertha, with their two sons aboard, was demonstrating the performance of the motor wagon to the crowd. Benz was furious, but with so many people around, he could not express his anger. He decided to inspect the condition of the motor wagon first. Upon close inspection, he found that the motor wagon had not been seriously damaged and was functioning normally despite the long journey. Benz was astonished by this. He was impressed by the durability of the motor wagon, which had successfully completed a long-distance journey he himself had never dared attempt. Then his mother-in-law approached, looked toward Bertha, who was enthusiastically promoting the motor wagon, and spoke quietly to Benz. She guessed Benz might be angry at Bertha's actions, but urged him to understand that Bertha had made this decision to help her husband. She emphasized that since Benz had been struggling to find a way to publicize the motor wagon, Bertha had taken it upon herself to find a solution. Hearing her words, Benz came to understand Bertha's deeper intentions. At that moment, Bertha, who had been presenting the motor wagon to the crowd, noticed Benz and ran toward him. Benz embraced her tightly, expressing his gratitude. That evening, Benz examined the condition of the motor wagon. Contrary to his expectations, the motor wagon had endured the long journey well, and there were no major mechanical problems. Benz was surprised and realized that the motor wagon's capabilities had been proven in a way he had never imagined. He became confident that with a few improvements, the motor wagon could reliably handle long-distance travel. This gave him hope that people might prefer an automobile like the motor wagon over horses or steam-powered vehicles. The next morning, after completing minor repairs, Benz returned to Mannheim with Bertha and their two sons. The day after they returned home, Benz was repairing the motor wagon. At that moment, Bertha approached and told him not to overexert himself, expressing her concern. Benz told her the repairs were nearly finished and pointed out some parts that had been worn due to heavy use. Bertha laughed and said she had little choice, as she rarely had the chance to drive the motor wagon. Benz admired her boldness and was amazed at her courage in deciding to travel such a long distance with her children. Then Bertha said she wanted to share some thoughts she had during the trip. Benz showed interest and asked if there had been any inconveniences or improvements needed during the operation of the motor wagon. To talk more comfortably, the two moved from the workbench to a table. Bertha explained that although the fuel and engine itself had no major issues, several improvements were necessary. First, she said, steering with the bar handle required too much strength and should be improved to allow easier control. Second, she pointed out that the brake leather wore out so quickly that it needed replacement after only a few days of driving. Lastly, she emphasized that climbing steep hills was difficult and required improvement. Listening to her, Benz began mapping out the necessary improvements in his mind. He became convinced that if the issues proven through her journey were resolved, the motor wagon could definitely become a marketable product. The more he listened to Bertha, the more confident he became that the motor wagon could succeed in the world. The motor wagon certainly had many issues at first. Sometimes the engine stalled or other components failed to operate. However, Benz worked to fix those problems, and through Bertha's journey, many of the motor wagon's issues were resolved, making it a better machine. At this time, Benz began researching a device to improve hill climbing based on Bertha's advice, ultimately creating a primitive transmission gear and installing it in the motor wagon. With newfound confidence, Benz decided to promote the motor wagon for sale. He went to a painter in Mannheim, commissioned a drawing of the motor wagon, and then took the finished artwork to a Mannheim newspaper office. At the newspaper office, Benz had a black and white poster made using the drawing and the newspaper's printing type. In 1888, there were no media such as radio or television, and paper was scarce, so newspapers were not widely distributed. Thus, the common method of promotion at the time was to create posters and put them up in crowded places. Because such posters were usually hand-painted in color by artists, they were expensive to produce. Since Benz did not have much financial leeway at the time, he opted for a cheaper black and white version. This black and white poster, created in 1888 to promote the motor wagon, became the world's first automobile advertisement poster. Encouraged by Bertha's successful long-distance journey and supported by his promotional efforts, Benz began receiving orders for the motor wagon. Thus, in the summer of 1888, Benz began the first commercial sales in automotive history. The second customer for the motor wagon was Emile Roger, a man who owned a bicycle factory in Paris. Roger had a special relationship with Benz, as he had already obtained rights to manufacture Benz engines in Paris, and had been producing and selling them for years. Thus, upon hearing that Benz was selling an automobile called the motor wagon, Roger placed an order. After receiving the motor wagon, Roger experienced its appearance and performance, and felt that it was truly a new mode of transportation that would shape the future. Thus, Roger acquired the rights from Benz to manufacture the motor wagon and build a factory in Paris, becoming the first to sell the motor wagon in France. However, by 1893, only a total of 25 motor wagons had been produced and sold.
This video continues as a series. Subscribe and you'll get a notification as soon as the next story comes up. Subscribe now and don't miss the next episode.